Southampton, spring 1943. Truck engines rumbled. American voices called out coordinates, and equipment clanged metallically as it was offloaded. Private Thomas Hewitt, 24, British Army, was standing by the commandeered schoolhouse acting as his unit's makeshift barracks, observing the convoy drive by 30 vehicles. 40, 50. He gave up counting. The Americans were endless. His friend, Corporal Davies, came out of the building, fastening his shirt. "They're still at it, then? Been 3 hours?" Thomas replied. "Where will they all go?" Davies sparked a cigarette, hands shielding the flame from the wind. "Everywhere. Rumor is they're occupying half the farmland in Wiltshire. Tidworth's pubs are 6 deep nightly. You can't order a beer without getting an American elbow." Thomas saw a youthful American serviceman, about 19, hang from a truck's window, waving to passing British girls. The girls, giggling, waved in return. Davies saw it as well. "And that," he grumbled. This was the situation in southern England during 1943 and 1944. Americans weren't merely arriving. They were pouring in. When the accumulation peaked in spring 1944, roughly 1.5 million American military personnel were based in Great Britain. 1.5 million. For a country of about 48 million, this signified that 1 of every 32 individuals on a British street was a U.S. soldier. In the southern counties, with the densest concentration, the proportion was much more striking. Whole villages were outnumbered by Americans bivouacked in adjacent fields. The sheer scale was astounding. The U.S. Army set up more than 1,000 installations throughout Britain. Air bases, supply dumps, medical facilities, training areas, staging points. Quonset huts popped up like fungi all over the English landscape. Commandeered estates were turned into HQs. Village halls were made into dining halls. The Americans imported 8 million tons of materiel. Vehicles, armaments, ammo, rations, fuel, and medical gear. The preparation for Operation Overlord, the Normandy invasion, necessitated converting southern England into history's biggest military assembly point. For the British, at war since 1939, this enormous American force's arrival sparked responses much more complicated than just thankfulness. Sergeant Major William Fletcher, British Army, was a veteran of North Africa. He had made it through Dunkirk earlier. In 1944 he was 36 but felt 60. His battalion was withdrawn to England for rest and resupply, meaning they were quartered in Dorset, drilling alongside U.S. units getting ready for the invasion. He observed the Americans in field training with mixed feelings he couldn't fully decipher. "Look at them," he remarked to his CO, Captain Morrison. They were on a hill watching a U.S. infantry company drill assault maneuvers. Fresh, each one looks like he's eaten 3 full meals daily his whole life. Morrison, having lost an eye in Italy, gave a slow nod. "They have. That's the entire point, really. We require them to be fresh." Fletcher recognized the truth in this. The British Army was worn out. 5 years of conflict had drained the nation. Losses from France, North Africa, Italy, the Atlantic, and the bombing campaign. The British fought on, still competent, but were spread precariously thin. The Americans' arrival, with their apparently infinite reserves of troops and equipment, signified the invasion was finally possible. Without them, no practical chance existed for a full-scale return to France. Yet, understanding a thing intellectually versus feeling, it were 2 different matters. "They have no idea what they're facing," Fletcher said softly. "Most have never seen battle. They expect it to be like the pictures. Some have," Morrison noted. "Those who were in North Africa, Sicily, Italy, those men know." "Some," Fletcher agreed. "But look at the majority. Just kids. The Germans will butcher them on the beaches." Morrison paused, then said, "Perhaps, but there are just so many, William. That is the difference. We will be landing with overpowering force. That is what the Americans provide. Not just troops, weight, mass, the capacity to take losses and continue advancing. This was the strategic assessment that allowed the invasion. The British and Canadians were to contribute major forces for D-Day. The Americans, however, supplied the numerical majority. By June 6, 1944, the Allied invading force comprised around 156,000 soldiers in the first wave. Americans would land about 73,000 men on Utah and Omaha. The British and Canadians would land about 83,000 on Gold, Juno, and Sword, yet behind these first waves was the massive American reserve in England, 1.5 million men. The Germans, regardless of skill or fortification, faced an army that could just keep advancing. For single British soldiers like Fletcher, observing these Americans drill, the feelings were complex. Solace that the load would be distributed. Annoyance it took this long. Pride in Britain's solitary endurance. Bitterness over the price paid. Underneath, a grief that Britain, alone against Hitler in 1940, now required rescue by its old colony. Fletcher never voiced these thoughts, but he felt them. As did many British troops, the frictions were not just military. They were personal, social, financial. In southern England's pubs, the tension was unavoidable. Mary Thornton, a barmaid at the King's Arms in Salisbury, witnessed it nightly. Americans came in groups, loud, self-assured, and wealthy. A U.S. private made $50 monthly, equaling about £10 sterling. A British private made £3 and 5 shillings monthly. Americans had money for rounds, for generous tips, for taking local girls to dinners and dances British soldiers couldn't afford. "It isn't their fault," Mary told her friend Ellen, a greengrocer. They walked home post-closing, coats drawn tight in the April rain. "They just spend what they earn. Say that to Tommy Bradshaw?" Ellen retorted. "His girl left him for a Yank last week. An Ohio lieutenant took her to London, lodged her in a real hotel. What can Tommy do? He has 7 shillings until the month ends." This situation birthed the well-known British grievance. "The problem with Yanks is they're overpaid, oversexed, and over here. The Americans," with typical wit, replied, "The problem with Brits is they're underpaid, oversexed, and under Eisenhower." Underneath the banter, true resentment brewed. British troops, tired from years of war on subsistence rations, saw American soldiers wooing British women with luxuries from a different world. Chocolate, nylons, cigarettes, fresh fruit items gone from British civilian life for years. The Americans, meanwhile, often failed to grasp why the British were so cold, so distant. They were here to help win. Why the lukewarm reception? The reason was complex. In 1944, Britain was a country 5 years into a war. The Blitz killed 40,000 plus civilians. Rationing cut the average British diet to monotonous survival. Cities carried bombing scars. Almost every family had suffered a loss. The British bore this while America stayed neutral, its factories selling Britain supplies at market prices, its government requiring payment for essential survival weapons. Americans joined the war post-Pearl Harbor, December 1941, to the British. This was almost 2.5 years after Britain faced Nazi Germany alone. The Americans were welcome, vital, but the undercurrent of "Where were you in 1940?" never fully faded. Lieutenant James Patterson, 26, Army from Pennsylvania, sensed this friction but didn't get it. He reached England in February 1944, 29th Infantry Division. His unit was quartered near Exeter. He attempted friendliness with local British troops, offered drinks, shared cigarettes. The British were civil but remote. One night in a pub, after pints loosened lips, a British sergeant finally clarified. "You want our thoughts, Yank? Fine, we're grateful you're here. We need you. We cannot win without you. But Christ, where were you in 1940? When London burned? At Dunkirk? You sat safe overseas while we were alone. Now you arrive with your chocolate, your money, your new uniforms, expecting gratitude. Well, we are. But we are also angry and tired, and we're sick of dying for 5 years while you debated helping." The sergeant finished his pint, slamming it down. "So yes, glad you're here. We need you. But don't anticipate a bloody parade." Patterson absorbed this for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "Fair enough," he said. The racial issues were still more complex and painful. The 1944 U.S. Army was segregated. Black troops served in separate units, led mostly by white officers, and were generally assigned to support duties. When these black American servicemen met British civilians, their reception was often distinctly different from the American South. British civilians, though not prejudice-free, lacked the formal segregation black GIs knew. British pubs served black soldiers. British families invited them for meals. British women went out with them. This made a situation white American MPs found unbearable, and black American GIs found eye-opening. Tensions erupted at Bamber Bridge, Lancashire, June 1943. Black troops from the 8th 153rd Aviation Engineer Battalion were based nearby. When white U.S. military police tried imposing segregation in a local pub, the British landlord refused. "This is England," he allegedly stated. "We don't practice segregation. All soldiers are welcome here." The conflict escalated. MPs tried to arrest the black soldiers. The soldiers fought back. Gunfire erupted. When it was over, one black soldier was dead, several injured, and the event revealed the stark contradictions of a U.S. Army fighting for liberty overseas while maintaining segregation internally. Bamber Bridge civilians mostly supported the black soldiers. Pub windows displayed signs, "Black troops only." This gesture of solidarity must have been surreal for men from a nation where whites-only signs were standard. Private First Class Albert Harris, a black GI from Georgia, wrote home regarding his time in England. "The people here treat us like human beings. I can go in any pub and get served. I can sit anywhere on the bus. British families have us for Sunday dinner. It's like being in a different world, Mum. I dread returning to the States after this." This was one more facet of British military and civilian opinion on the American arrival. Many British were truly appalled by U.S. racial policies. They couldn't grasp why the U.S. Army demanded segregation. They saw it as offensive and honestly hypocritical. Britain had its own racial biases. Definitely, but the formal, legal segregation of the American South was alien to British life. So, when British troops discussed the Americans, race was frequently in the discussion. Some British troops befriended black GIs, precisely from sympathy for their plight. Others adopted American racial views. This mix of British and American forces highlighted these contradictions, creating tensions that military leaders on both sides found hard to control. By spring 1944, with the invasion nearing, the immense scale of the American presence had made southern England something new. Roads were jammed with U.S. convoys. Skies thundered with U.S. aircraft. Harbors were crammed with U.S. ships. Every field and wood seemed to conceal American tanks, trucks, and artillery. Wing Commander Jeffrey Page, R.F., flew reconnaissance over southern England in April 1944. His aerial view was staggering. "In some areas, you couldn't see the ground," he later wrote. "Only vehicles. Thousands and thousands of vehicles. Tanks were arrayed in orchards. Supply depots stretching for miles. Landing craft filled every harbor and estuary. It seemed we had paved half of England with military gear." This was the physical evidence of American industrial power. The factories in Detroit, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, operating 24/7, had manufactured this avalanche of war supplies. British factories performed production miracles, yet couldn't equal the American scale. The Americans delivered abundance to a country that endured 5 years of scarcity. British civilians also had mixed feelings about this. On one hand, American supply depots meant access to items long gone from British life. American GIs were generous, sharing cigarettes, chocolate, and tinned goods with British families. Children trailed American GIs, aware they might give out sweets. British women dating Americans suddenly got stockings, soap, and makeup impossible to get via British rations. This generosity, however, emphasized the disparity. Britain was depleted, rationed, and coping. America appeared to have endless supplies of everything. The difference was, at times, painful. Mrs. Dorothy Hughes, a Portsmouth widow, husband killed at El Alamein, hosted American GIs for Sunday dinner multiple times. "Lovely boys," she later remembered. "So polite, so young, they brought food from their mess a godsend. Tinned ham, real coffee, sugar items I hadn't seen in years. But it was also difficult. My husband died on bully beef and hardtack in the desert. These boys got steaks, fresh vegetables, endless cigarettes. I was grateful for their help. But I also felt, if Britain had possessed these resources, maybe my Tom would be alive." This was the paradox. Americans were essential, welcome, and needed, yet their presence was also a reminder of all Britain had lost. Old Britain could no longer supply its own troops. As June neared, the tension in southern England grew almost unbearable. Everybody knew the invasion was imminent. The enormous buildup was impossible to hide. The only question was when. British and American troops drilled together, planned together, and waited together. The initial caution between them had frequently developed into mutual respect. British troops saw many Americans were brave, competent, and teachable. American troops saw the British had withstood years of war and had knowledge the Americans lacked. Sergeant Fletcher, the NCO who observed American training with mixed emotions, was assigned to help train U.S. infantry in urban combat techniques. The British had learned these lessons in Italy. Fletcher was 3 weeks with a U.S. rifle company, instructing them on clearing buildings, moving through debris, and handling snipers. The American CO, Captain Robert Jensen, Minnesota, 27, was green, but he listened. He posed questions. He drilled his men on the techniques until they were correct. After 3 weeks, Fletcher had changed his assessment. "They're green," he informed Captain Morrison, "but not stupid. And they're willing to learn. That means something." "Will they be ready?" Morrison asked. Fletcher thought. "No, you aren't ready for combat until you're in it. But they are as prepared as we can get them. And there are so bloody many. If half freeze up on the beach, the other half is still enough to do the job." This was the calculation. The Americans provided overwhelming numbers. Not all would be effective. Many would die in their first fight, but the force's sheer weight would prevail. This was the meaning of 1.5 million men in Britain. This is what enabled the invasion. On June 5, 1944, the invasion force started moving. The staging areas emptied. Convoys headed for the ports. Ships started loading. British and American troops, after months living together, training, drinking, and brawling in pubs, now ready to fight Germans together. Private Thomas Hewitt, who saw the Americans arrive over a year ago, found himself on a Southampton landing craft beside U.S. soldiers from the 1st Infantry Division. Destination: Omaha Beach. Thomas was a North Africa veteran. He knew what was ahead. He observed the young Americans near him. Some were clearly terrified. Some masked it with bravado. He felt a surge of something, not affection, not camaraderie, but something. A U.S. private, perhaps 20, from Texas by his accent, met Thomas's gaze. "First invasion?" the American asked. Thomas shook his head. "North Africa." "Sicily? You?" "First time," the American confessed. Scared shitless. "Good," Thomas said. "You ought to be. Fear keeps you sharp. Remember your training. Head down, obey your sergeant." "You'll be fine," the American nodded, unconvinced, but thankful for the words. "Thanks, buddy." The landing craft moved from the dock. England faded. Ahead lay the French coast, German defenses, the unknown. British and American soldiers crammed into the landing craft's metal box, bound for history's largest amphibious assault. What did British troops say when 1.5 million Gs arrived, making the invasion possible? Many things. They grumbled about Americans being overpaid and oversexed. They resented the late entry. They ridiculed American war naivety. They were irked by American confidence and plenty. But they also murmured in pubs, barracks, and training fields, "Thank God they're here. We can't do this alone. We need them," they said. "They're green, but they'll learn." "We did," they said. "Look at them all. The Germans cannot stop this." "There are too many," they said. "Maybe this time we will actually win. Maybe we'll end it." The British response to the American buildup was never just simple gratitude. It was complex: pride, resentment, exhaustion, relief, class tension, racial contradictions, economic disparity, the weight of 5 years of war. Yet beneath the complexity lay a basic truth most British soldiers and civilians knew. Even if unstated, the Americans were here. The invasion was possible. The war was winnable. On June 6, 1944, 156,000 Allied troops hit the Normandy beaches. They came from Britain, Canada, America. They arrived in landing craft assembled in southern England over months. They were backed by a 7,000-ship armada and shielded by 12,000 aircraft. They came because 1.5 million American Gees had come to Britain, enabling the assembly of a force big enough to breach Hitler's Atlantic Wall. The invasion succeeded, not easily, not without horrific casualties. Omaha Beach was a slaughterhouse, but the Allies made it ashore. They held the beaches, they advanced inland, and they kept coming, wave on wave, because behind the first assault force lay the huge reserve of men and materiel built up in Britain for 2 years. Private Thomas Hewitt survived D-Day. The young Texan did too, though wounded and evacuated 3 days later. Sergeant Fletcher reached Caen before a sniper killed him. Captain Jensen led his company through France to Germany, captured at the Battle of the Bulge, the British-American alliance. So, strained in southern England's pubs and barracks, worked where it counted, on the battlefield. The two armies learned cooperation. British experience plus American resources created something more effective than either alone. Years after, veterans from both sides recalled those pre-D-Day months in Britain with complex emotions. The tensions were real, the resentments were real, but the shared purpose was also real. They were true allies, not from mutual affection, but from mutual need and a choice to stand together. The 1.5 million American G is arriving in Britain from 1942 to 1944 enabled Europe's liberation. The British knew this. They didn't always like it, they didn't always phrase it gracefully, but they knew. And when landing craft hit Normandy's beaches, when British and American troops fought together through French hedgerows, when they crossed the Rhine together, driving into Germany's heart, the words from England's pubs and barracks mattered less than their joint actions. They had united, these two nations, one exhausted, proud, one fresh, powerful, launching the invasion that shattered Nazi Germany's hold on Europe. This was what 1.5 million American soldiers made possible. That was its meaning. All else was just the complex human truth of reaching that point, with all the friction, frustration, and reluctant respect arising when different people must learn to fight as one. The British moaned about the Americans, and then they fought alongside them. And that, ultimately, was what mattered most.